The wind that howls through the mountain passes northwest of Beijing carries with it a chill that feels older than memory. Even today, if you stand upon the jagged ridges of the Jining district, looking out over the rugged terrain where the grasslands of the steppe crash abruptly into the granite spine of northern China, there is a haunting silence. It is a landscape defined by harsh verticality, a place where the horizon is broken by peaks and ravines, unsuited for the thundering charge of cavalry and hostile to the movement of massive armies. Yet it was here, in the shadow of these looming cliffs, that the course of human history was violently wrenched from its predicted path. It was here that the impossible happened. To understand the magnitude of the event that took place in the autumn of the year 1211, one must first dismantle the modern perception of the Mongol Empire. We often think of them as an inevitability, a wave of destruction that was destined to wash over the world. But in the early 13th century, this was not the case. The Mongols were the underdogs of the highest order. They were a newly unified confederation of tribes, smelling of felt and mare's milk, possessing no cities, no agriculture, and no written history of empire building. Opposing them was the Jin Dynasty. This was not merely a state, it was a superpower. The Jin controlled the vast, fertile heartlands of northern China and Manchuria. They commanded a population of nearly 50 million people. Their cities were marvels of engineering and culture, their armories overflowed with iron and steel, and their military was a professional machine that had already crushed the Song dynasty and forced them south. The Jin army that marched to the frontier numbered in the hundreds of thousands, perhaps 500,000 men, supported by a logistical tail that could feed a nation. When the great Khan of the Mongols decided to challenge this golden colossus, it was viewed by the civilized world not as a war, but as a suicide pact. The sheer disparity in numbers was laughable. The Mongols could field perhaps 90,000 to 100,000 troopers. The Jin outnumbered them 5 to 1, perhaps even 10 to 1 in total available reserves. By every conventional metric of warfare, manpower, resources, technology, fortification, the nomads should have been crushed before they even breached the outer defenses. The conflict began not on the battlefield, but in the realm of pride. For generations, the Jin had treated the steppe tribes as vassals and nuisances. They managed the nomads through a brutal policy of divide and rule, occasionally venturing north to cull the strong men and ensure no single leader could rise. When a new Jin emperor ascended the throne, he demanded submission from the northern tribes. Instead of kneeling to receive the imperial edict, the Mongol leader turned south, spat on the ground, and rode away. It was a calculated insult, a declaration that the old order was dead. But insults do not win wars. The Mongol leader knew that a head-on collision with the Jin military on the open plains of China would be disastrous. The Jin heavy cavalry, the iron pagodas, were encased in heavy armor that Mongol arrows could struggle to penetrate. Their infantry formations were vast and disciplined. To defeat a giant, one does not wrestle it. One must lure it into a trap where its size becomes its own undoing. The invasion began with a series of probing attacks, designed to test the reflexes of the Jin defenses. The Mongols moved with a speed that baffled the sedentary commanders of the south. They crossed the Gobi Desert, a logistical feat that the Jin strategists deemed impossible for a large army. By the time the Jin court realized the severity of the threat, the Mongols were already tearing through the border fortifications. The Jin response was to mobilize the Grand Army. Under the command of Wanyan Jujin, a general of high standing but traditional thinking, the Jin forces moved to block the mountain passes. Wanyan Jujin was confident. He looked at the map and saw that the Mongols had to pass through the Taihang Mountains to reach the rich plains around the capital, Zhongdu, which is modern-day Beijing. He decided to turn the geography against the invaders. The location he chose was known as the Badger's Mouth. It is a treacherous, winding mountain pass flanked by steep cliffs. The terrain is a nightmare for maneuvering. Wanyan Jujin's strategy was ostensibly sound. He would plug the pass with his massive army. He believed that by occupying the high ground and the narrow choke points, he could stall the Mongol advance, starve them out, or crush them with sheer weight of numbers if they tried to push through. He built stone fortifications, set up palisades, and deployed his vast infantry and cavalry reserves in a deep, layered defense. However, in war, your greatest strength can become your fatal weakness. The Jin commander made a catastrophic error in his deployment. He did not account for the communication lag inherent in managing an army of 500,000 men in mountainous terrain. By packing his forces into the winding valleys and ridges, he stripped them of their mobility. The Jin army became a dragon trapped in a box, unable to turn, unable to strike, and crucially, unable to retreat. As the Mongols approached the Badger's mouth, their scouts reported the situation. A lesser commander might have turned back, seeing the valleys choked with enemy spears and banners stretching as far as the eye could see. But the Mongol way of war was predicated on adaptability. They saw what the Jin commander did not. The Jin army was not a single, cohesive force, but a series of disconnected units, isolated from one another by the very terrain they were trying to use as a shield. The Mongol leadership held a council of war. They knew they could not engage the entire Jin line at once. They had to shatter the front, create panic, and let the fear do the rest. The plan they devised relied on concentrating their entire striking power on a single critical point of the Jin line, rather than spreading out. The battle opened with a move that stunned the Jin defenders. The Mongols did not unleash a rain of arrows from a distance, as was their custom. The terrain was too rugged, the sightlines too broken. Instead, the Mongol vanguard, led by the brilliant General Mukhali, did something unthinkable. They dismounted. The Mongols, born in the saddle, who lived and died on their horses, got off their mounts. The terrain at the Badger's mouth was so steep and rocky that horses were a liability. Mukhali addressed his shock troops, the suicide squads who had volunteered for the vanguard. He told them that there was no retreat. He told them that the only way to survive was to cut a path through the wall of iron before them. With a roar that echoed off the granite cliffs, the Mongol vanguard charged uphill on foot. They wielded heavy lances, axes, and curved sabers. It was a brutal, visceral melee. The Jin heavy infantry, expecting a cavalry charge or a skirmish, were caught off guard by the ferocity of the assault. The Mongols fugue. With the desperation of men who knew they were deep in enemy territory with no hope of rescue. Simultaneously, the main body of the Mongol army began to maneuver. While Mukhali's vanguard pinned down the Jin center, other Mongol tumens, units of 10,000, began to scale the treacherous ridges on the flanks. These were slopes the Jin had deemed impassable, leaving them lightly defended. The Mongol ponies, sure-footed and rugged, scrambled up goat paths and scree slopes, carrying archers to positions overlooking the Jin main body. From the high ground, the Mongols began to rain death upon the packed ranks of the Jin army below. The Jin soldiers, crammed into the narrow valley floor, had nowhere to go. They were packed so tightly that they could barely raise their shields. The arrows fell in dark clouds, finding the gaps in armor, striking men and horses alike. Panic began to ripple through the Jin ranks. This was the moment the Jin numerical advantage turned into a curse. Wanyanjujin, situated in his command post, attempted to send orders to his forward units to hold the line and to his reserves to move up in support. But the messengers could not get through the crush of bodies. The narrow passes were clogged with soldiers, baggage trains, and terrified horses. The Jin command and control structure completely collapsed. The front line, hammered by Mukhali's suicide charge and withered by arrow fire from above, began to buckle. But they could not retreat, because their own reserves were pushing forward from behind, unaware of the disaster unfolding at the front. The Jin army began to crush itself. Men were trampled by their own comrades. Horses panicked, rearing and kicking in the confined space, causing chaos. Sensing the confusion, the Mongol Great Khan unleashed his heavy cavalry. By this point, the fighting had spilled out of the tightest choke points into slightly more open ground within the pass. The Mongol heavy lancers, clad in lamellar armor, slammed into the wavering Jin formations. The impact was devastating. The Jin soldiers, already demoralized and disorganized, shattered. What followed was not a battle, but a rout. And in the context of medieval warfare, the rout is where the killing happens. The Jin army broke. Hundreds of thousands of men turned and fled. But there was nowhere to run. The mountains that Wanyanjujin had hoped would serve as his walls now became his prison. The Mongols pursued with ruthless efficiency. They cut down fleeing soldiers by the thousands. The narrow ravines of the Badger's mouth became choked with the dead. It is written in the chronicles that for decades afterward, the pass was white with the bleached bones of the Jin army, a grim monument to the scale of the massacre. Travelers would slip on the grease of decaying bodies, and the smell of death hung over the mountains for years. But the tactical victory at the Badger's mouth was only half the story. The true brilliance of the Mongol victory lay in the strategic exploitation of the breakthrough. Wanyan Jujin had committed the flower of the Jin military to this single battle. He had stripped the garrisons of the Central Plains to build his grand army. When that army was annihilated, the Jin Dynasty was left with a hollow shell. The Mongols did not stop to celebrate. They poured through the pass and spilled out onto the North China Plain. The sight of the Mongol banners descending from the mountains must have been the stuff of nightmares for the peasantry and the nobility alike. The Jin capital, Zhengdu, was now exposed. The psychological impact of the defeat at Yehuling cannot be overstated. The Jin had always believed in their martial superiority. They were the Jurchen, the conquerors of the north. To be utterly dismantled by a barbarian tribe shattered their national psyche. Governors surrendered their cities without a fight. Generals defected, bringing their troops over to the Mongol side. The aura of invincibility that held the Jin Empire together had evaporated in the mountain mist. Furthermore, the battle revealed the inherent fragility of the Jin state. It was an empire ruled by a minority elite over a vast Han Chinese population that held no deep loyalty to their Jurchen masters. When the Jin army was destroyed, the social contract frayed. Rebellions sparked across the countryside, further distracting the Jin court and aiding the Mongol advance. The great Khan utilized this political instability masterfully. He presented himself not just as a conqueror, but as a deliverer to those who had been oppressed by the Jin. He incorporated Chinese engineers and siege experts into his army, learning the art of destroying cities as quickly as he had learned the art of field warfare. The victory at Yehuling gave him the resources and the talent pool he needed to transform his army from a nomadic raiding force into an imperial war machine capable of conquering the world. We must also look at the leadership dynamic. On the Jin side, Wanyan Jujin represented the stagnation of a settled empire. He relied on doctrine, on maps, on the assumption that the rules of war were static. He believed that A plus B equals C, that more men and better ground equals victory. He lacked imagination. On the other side, the Mongol leadership operated with a fluid, terrifying creativity. They understood that war is not arithmetic, it is chemistry. It is volatile. They were willing to take risks that seemed insane to a conventional commander, like dismounting in the face of heavy infantry, because they understood the psychology of their enemy. They knew that if they could break the Jin spirit, the Jin body would die. The Mongol communication system also played a pivotal role. While the Jin orders were stuck in traffic jams of their own making, the Mongols used a system of flags, horns, and arrow messengers to coordinate complex maneuvers across difficult terrain. Every Mongol trooper knew the intent of H is commander. They operated with a decentralized autonomy that allowed them to react to the shifting tides of battle faster than their opponents. As the sun set on the day of the battle, the balance of power in East Asia had shifted irrevocably. The Jin dynasty would limp on for another 2 decades, hiding behind the walls of their cities, but they were a walking corpse. The spine of their power had been snapped at Yehuling. The wealth of northern China, the silk, the grain, the iron, the artisans, was now at the mercy of the Mongols. This influx of wealth and technology catalyzed the expansion of the Mongol Empire. With the resources captured from the Jin, the Mongols were able to launch campaigns to the west, into Central Asia, Persia, and eventually Europe. The siege engines built by Chinese engineers captured after Yehuling would be the same ones used to batter down the walls of Baghdad and Kiev. In a very real sense, the road to the Adriatic Sea began at the Badger's mouth. It is difficult to comprehend the carnage. Historical records suggest that the Jin casualties were so high that the empire simply ran out of soldiers. They began to press gang peasants who had never held a spear, further degrading their military effectiveness. The destruction of the elite Central Army meant that the institutional knowledge of the Jin military, the veterans, the instructors, the career officers, was wiped out in a single afternoon. The battle also marked the ascendancy of the Mongol meritocracy. Generals like Mukhali were not princes of the blood. They were men who had risen through the ranks based on skill and loyalty. This contrasted sharply with the Jin, where command was often a function of court politics and lineage. The hungry, talented wolves of the steppe devoured the fat, complacent lions of the palace. In the aftermath, the great Khan did not rush to besiege the capital immediately. He knew that a wounded beast is dangerous. He spent the autumn ravaging the countryside, cutting off supplies and spreading terror. He allowed refugees to flood into Zhongdu, knowing that extra mouths would strain the city's food stores and spread disease and panic. It was a cold, calculated strategy of attrition that was made possible only by the total dominance achieved at Yehuling. When we look back at this event, it serves as a grim reminder of the hubris of power. The Jin Dynasty believed they were too big to fail. They believed that their walls and their numbers made them safe. They forgot that safety is an illusion, and that history is driven by the hungry, the desperate, and the innovative. The Mongols succeeded because they changed the paradigm. They did not try to be a better version of the Jin army. They forced the Jin to fight a war they did not understand. They turned the mountains, which should have been the Jin's greatest ally, into their greatest enemy. They turned the Jin's numbers, their greatest asset, into their greatest liability. The Battle of Yehuling stands as one of the most decisive military engagements in human history. It was the moment the dam broke. It was the moment the Mongol storm, which had been gathering strength on the high plateau, finally crashed down upon the civilized world. It proved that a highly mobile, disciplined, and ruthlessly led force could defeat an entrenched superpower, regardless of the odds. As the wind continues to blow through the Jining district today, whistling through the rocks that once ran red with blood, it whispers a lesson that resonates through the centuries. It tells us that empires are fragile things, built on the shifting sands of perception and power. It tells us that on the right day, in the right place, with the right will, the world can be turned upside down. The silence of the badger's mouth is the silence of a graveyard, yes, but it is also the silence of a ground zero. This is where the old world ended, and the new world, forged in fire and blood under the gaze of the eternal blue sky, began. The legacy of that day is written on the maps of the modern world, in the genetic lineage of millions, and in the enduring legend of the horseman who rode out of the nothingness to conquer everything. To deeply grasp the mechanics of this victory, we must return to the mind of the great Khan. He was not merely a savage warlord, he was a strategic savant. Before the battle, he spent weeks in prayer to the sky god Tengri, but he also spent weeks gathering intelligence. He knew the names of the Jin commanders. He knew their rivalries. He knew which units were comprised of loyal Jurchens and which were conscripted Han Chinese or Khitans who might break under pressure. This intelligence war was the invisible precursor to the physical battle. The Mongols had infiltrated the Jin borderlands long before the main army arrived. They had turned local officials, bribed border guards, and mapped the goat paths. When Wanyan Zhujin deployed his army, he was playing chess against an opponent who could see his pieces in the dark. The Jin relied on the 9 fortresses system, a network of strongholds designed to slow down invaders. But fortifications are static. They require the enemy to cooperate by attacking them. The Mongols simply bypassed the strong points, isolating them and cutting them off from support. By the time the Jin realized that their static defenses were useless, the Mongols were already deep in their rear, threatening their supply lines. At Yehuling, the compression of the Jin army was so severe that contemporary accounts described the soldiers as being stacked like logs. This is a crucial detail. In hand-to-hand combat, space is life. You need room to swing a sword, to brace a spear, to step back from a blow. By denying the Jin soldiers this space, the Mongols effectively disarmed them. 100,000 men who cannot lift their arms are not an army, they are a mob. And then there was the weaponry. The Mongol composite bow was a marvel of technology, capable of punching through armor at ranges that outclassed the Jin crossbows in terms of rate of fire and mobility. But at Yehuling, the Mongols also utilized heavy iron maces and hooks, designed to pull riders from their horses. They adapted their kit for the specific requirements of the close-quarters slaughter in the pass. The collapse of the Jin center sent shockwaves that were physical as well as psychological. As the front ranks turned to flee, they collided with the rear ranks who were still advancing. In the confusion, officers lost control. Banners, the primary means of signaling, fell or were trampled. Once the banners were down, the unit ceased to exist as a fighting force. It became a collection of terrified individuals. The Mongols, conversely, maintained strict discipline. Looting was forbidden until the battle was won. Any man who stopped to strip a corpse while the enemy still fought was executed on the spot. This discipline allowed the Mongols to maintain the pressure, to keep the momentum going until the Jin rout was total. The pursuit that followed was arguably more lethal than the battle itself. The Mongols chased the broken remnants of the Jin army for nearly 30 miles. They harried them relentlessly, preventing them from regrouping, preventing them from resting. This was the deep battle doctrine centuries before it was named. The goal was not just to win the field, but to destroy the enemy's capacity to ever fight again. When the dust finally settled, the Jin Dynasty had lost its teeth. They would spend the rest of their existence cowering behind walls, paying tribute, and watching their empire dissolve. The psychological dominance of the Mongols was absolute. They had proven that the Dragon Throne was vulnerable, that the mandate of heaven had shifted. The narrative of Yehuling is a testament to the power of asymmetry. It demonstrates that in the calculus of war, the variable of leadership and adaptability often outweighs the variable of mass. The Jin were fighting a war of attrition. The Mongols were fighting a war of annihilation. The Jin were fighting to preserve the status quo. The Mongols were fighting to create a new reality. In the end, the story of this battle is the story of a collision between two eras. The rigid, bureaucratic, heavy feudalism of the Jin could not withstand the fluid, meritocratic, dynamic force of the steppe. The badger's mouth swallowed the old world, and from the silence of that mountain pass, the roar of the Mongol Empire began to echo across the earth, a sound that would not fade for centuries. This was the crucible. This was the turning point. This was the day the world changed.